The most diverse groups of land plants are the seed plants. The seed plants that don't make flowers or fruits, these are called the gymnosperms. So the gymno part of gymnosperm, that actually means naked. And it refers to the fact that the seeds are produced not within a fruit, but within a structure like this, a cone. And it's kind of a fine detail. In a cone like this, there are seeds in here as this matures. And the scales on this cone are just sort of overlapping and covering the seeds. Sometimes they're even sealed up, but developmentally, there's not continuous tissue that covers up the seeds in here. So the seeds are out on their own. The ovules are actually more exposed during pollination. And then they develop into seeds that are released as these scales on the cones release, kind of separate from each other and let them out. So gymnosperms means naked seeds, as in not having fruits on the outside of the seeds. And for us in Wisconsin, our gymnosperms are what we call conifers. So these are the cone-having trees. That's what conifer means. They have cones, pine cones, spruce cones, hemlock cones, and just a little exception here, juniper, we'll get into that. These often get referred to as juniper berries. So conifers are seed plants, as I said. Seed plants have pollen and ovules, so they have separate pollen cones and ovule cones, typically. And so the pollen cones produce pollen, release that. This is a source of wind pollination. And the ovule, earlier on in development, they are receiving the pollen for fertilization. That develops into a seed, and that's contained within the mature ovule cone. So seed plants, but not flowering plants. That's our conifers. Our plants locally, these are mostly monoecious plants. So separate pollen-producing cones and ovule-producing cones. The pollen-producing cones, you might not have noticed these. They're short-lived, as a lot of pollen-producing structures are. But at that particular time of year, they make a big effect in dropping a lot of pollen into the air. So people have allergy effects from this. You might notice that your car gets covered in yellow pollen around this time of year. You'll see the pollen settling down on the surfaces of water bodies. So a lot of pollen produced when these guys are flowering, or sorry, not flowering, pollinating. And their target are these ovule cones. And I've grabbed a picture, a really nice picture here, that shows ovule cones early in their development. So you notice that those scales are very open, and they're each associated with some ovules where that pollen can get in and do fertilization. This is a very small structure relatively. These are going to develop into pine cones, but at this stage, they're very small. They're open to the environment, and they need to be open to receive the pollen from the air. So it actually turns out that the development of a pine cone takes a couple of years to get you that big structure after successful fertilization. So I'll go through some of the diversity. Conifers are not terribly diverse in Wisconsin, also not terribly diverse worldwide, but lots of significant plants in these groups. This is a major component of northern forests. The boreal forests, the far northern forests, are lots of conifers. These are plants that can handle cold winters, dry temperatures. They're well adapted for the places that they do grow in the world. First family here, this is the pine family, or Pinaceae, containing pine. Pine is in a genus called Pinus, so who knew? Pretty easy one to remember there. The pine family contains pines, but also spruce, fir, hemlock, tamarack, and so on. I would characterize these as having typically longer leaves. Their needles are actually leaves. We call them needles, but they're just modified leaves. They're well protected against drying out and freezing. That's why they take on that shape. The needle shape is a nice adaptive shape for holding on to your, keeping from having frost damage, basically. Their cones are also typically longer, so larger needles, larger cones. Cones are woody in pines. They're kind of papery in spruce, kind of in between maybe in hemlock and tamarack, variety of sizes, as you can see here. The cones have a spiral phyllotaxis to them, so they're spirally arranged, and that's going to contrast with the next family that we look at. So those were some seed cones, and then just want to highlight some more of these pollen cones. Again, not something you typically notice, but if you ever do see these structures on one of these conifers at this time of year, this is a good thing to be able to know what you're looking at. Not too much distinction to those, I would say, or just larger than the next family we'll look at. Next family is called Cupressaceae. This is the juniper or cypress, or for us, the cedar family, the red cedar family. Red cedar, white cedar. And a couple big differences in how their seed cones are put together. They do have woody seed cones, and their seed cones on these plants are rather small, so definitely small compared to the average Pinaceae seed cone. And they have an opposite phyllotaxis. So you notice these two scales on the cone are across from each other. These are across from each other, helpful for identifying these. The needles, sometimes they have this more triangular scale type of format. So each of these triangles on here is a separate leaf, not very much needle-like. This is distinctive of the white cedar or arborvitae kind of leaf arrangement. Juniper also has those scale leaves sometimes, or sometimes they have these short pointy needles on them. So if you see the scale type of leaves, that's a pretty good indicator you've got Cupressaceae, but it's not every time. I mentioned the woody cones of the white cedar, and then in juniper, the genus is called Juniperus. We have what we call juniper berries. They're not berries, but they function ecologically a lot like a fleshy fruit. So they're still cones, they're still gymnosperm cones. So during their early development, they're open to the environment. And as they mature, they kind of grow themselves around so that they're all sealed up, and they take on this blue color. They have a fragrant aroma when you squash them. They are tasty to some kinds of animals, and of course they have seeds inside. So functioning a lot like a fruit, but of course not technically a fruit, and a good one to know what you're looking at there if you ever catch them. The pollen cones of Cupressaceae also on the smaller side, so lots of examples again of these more scale type of leaves, and a lot of times just a structure you'd hardly notice as a pollen producing cone, but it's sort of at the end of these little branches here on the white cedar, on the false cypress, on the juniper, short-lived at the time of year when they're producing their pollen. And then one other family that's worth mentioning in Wisconsin, this is commonly used as an ornamental plant. It's also, interestingly, very toxic, and it makes these berries. The berries are edible, but I wouldn't dare, because inside of them is a seed that is terribly toxic. So it turns out that these are actually arils, so another structure that looks kind of like a fleshy fruit, but the fleshy red stuff, this is associated with a seed and not really the cone itself. And inside of there is a smooth seed on the female component here producing the seed, and then the male component producing pollen. So this is Taxus, or the common name is Yew, yew. Hey, yew plant. There's a little bit of a geographic pattern to our conifers. As I mentioned, conifers do well in more northern environments. Some of these species are distinctly north of the tension zone. This is the black spruce, Picea mariana. Here's another one. This is the fir, north of the tension zone. Another one north of the tension zone. And then kind of a curious pattern. This is one of the junipers with a pattern that's south of the tension zone. So you don't have to be north of the tension zone if you're a conifer. These junipers are well adapted to our more kind of our dry prairie habitat. They do pretty well there. And then some just kind of distributed throughout the state. So I just mentioned here some genus names, some common names, and family names that they belong to. Pretty good to identify these if you get some practice. They're not too hard to learn. And then, as I mentioned, locally we are conifers. So in the darker color are the ones you can find, the families you can find in Wisconsin. Also in the gymnosperms, we have interesting plants like ginkgo, which is a broadleaf conifer. Cycads also have broad leaves, kind of a little bit like a palm leaf. Very diverse, but also tropical. So ones we won't run into around here, but some of these are ornamental plants. And then just a little collection here of a couple families that are restricted to Southern Hemisphere for the most part.